The letter arrived on a Wednesday. No gold seal, no palace courier. Just a white envelope slipped into Meghan's Montecito mailbox, as if it were an ordinary bill. She opened it with a knife, careful, deliberate. You are cordially invited to attend the 2025 Royal Reconciliation Forum at Windsor Castle. His Majesty King Charles III extends this invitation in the spirit of unity and historical healing. There was no apology, no warmth. Just polished formality and the signature, Charles R. She placed it on the counter and stared at it. For a moment, she didn't move. Later that evening, Harry walked in and saw it. "You're not going," he said immediately. Meghan didn't answer right away. "I think I am," she finally replied. "Why?" "Because silence helps them sleep. And I'm done helping." Across the Atlantic, in Buckingham Palace, Charles stood at the window of the blue drawing room. Behind him, aides were reviewing press angles. One of them hesitated. She might use the forum to make a statement. Charles didn't turn around. "She always does," he said softly. "But this time," he added, "I want to hear it." The Royal Reconciliation Forum had been announced just weeks earlier. An elegant gesture, designed to signal modernization. Panels on family, empire, unity. A camera-friendly way to repackage old scars. But Charles knew the real reason it existed. Not for history. Not even for the monarchy. It existed for the public. To make the past palatable. When Meghan's RSVP arrived, accepted, the headline spun. "She's returning. Duchess faces the crown again. Windsor showdown." Meghan said nothing. But she packed quietly. No stylist. No entourage. Just her voice. And one sentence she had been holding for far too long: Windsor Castle had never looked so carefully staged. Cameras mounted on velvet-draped pillars. Rows of chairs facing a gilded panel table. Royal banners freshly pressed. The world was watching, live. Charles entered first. Regal, but not stiff. Aware, perhaps, that grace would be judged more than grandeur today. He took his seat with a slight nod to the front row. No words yet. Then Meghan walked in. There was no fanfare, but the room shifted. Eyes turned. Breath paused. Her outfit was simple, sharp lines, no royal blue, no brooches. A message in restraint. Charles looked up as she approached the table. Their eyes met. "Duchess," he said quietly. She stopped, then replied just as softly. "Not anymore." Gasps didn't echo, but they were felt. The moderator, a Cambridge historian with perfectly chosen neutrality, cleared his throat and welcomed the attendees. "We are here today," he said, "to reflect. Not to revise. To hear truths, not retell legends." Meghan leaned slightly forward. "With respect," she said, "that depends on who's allowed to speak." All pretense of ceremony cracked at the edge. Charles adjusted his cuff. "You've been allowed." "No," Meghan said. "I've been observed." Silence. "You protected the institution," she continued, voice even. "You shielded tradition. But when I was drowning in press abuse, racial smears, and fear, you didn't lift a finger. Not even for your son." Charles looked down at the table. His knuckles tensed, but he said nothing. Meghan's gaze held steady. "You protected the crown. Never us." The words weren't loud, but they hit like thunder. The room froze. Even the moderator forgot to blink. This was no longer a forum. It was a reckoning, and it had only just begun. Charles sat still, hands folded on the table like he was gripping something ancient, lineage, legacy, or simply restraint. He'd been challenged before. But not like this. Not by family. Not on live television. "I am sorry you felt unprotected," he began, voice measured. "But the institution must endure. It's larger than any one of us." Meghan tilted her head slightly. "That's the problem. It always is." The audience didn't move. You could hear the breath catch in one of the reporters' mics. "You speak of duty," she continued. "But what is duty if it abandons people for perception? What is tradition if it silences survival?" Charles exhaled slowly, then responded with care. "We offered support in ways we could. Discreetly. Respectfully. You offered silence," Meghan cut in. "You asked me to blend in while I bled out. Not one statement. Not one defense. You protected the palace press more than your own grandson's mother." It was no longer debate. It was exposure. A younger panelist, a Ghanaian journalist seated beside the historian, broke the tension. "Your Majesty," she asked, "do you believe the monarchy has ever truly accounted for the pain it's caused, even within its own walls?" Charles turned toward her. His voice wavered, just barely. "I believe reflection is a beginning. But the past is difficult." "Not when you lived it," Meghan said. "It's not difficult. It's daily." Charles looked at her again. But this time, something cracked, an old instinct to defend replaced by the quiet realization that this wasn't a political moment. It was personal. And public. The camera zoomed in, not on the crown, but on his eyes. For the first time, King Charles III looked uncertain. And Meghan, calm, finished her thought. "You never protected us, because protecting us would have meant admitting the system was broken." She leaned back in her chair. "Maybe you weren't ready to say that." Outside, the palace lawn stood pristine under the London sun. But inside the chamber, every light, every lens, every breath now fixated on the widening rift between past and present. Between crown and conscience. Charles adjusted his seat, but his posture was no longer regal. It was tight. Pulled inward. "I must remind you," he said, "that monarchy is bound by constraints, diplomatic, traditional, constitutional. We don't simply speak because we feel. We measure. We preserve." Meghan didn't blink. "Then maybe that's why people stop listening." Her voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. The room bent toward it like metal to magnet. "You preserve legacy," she continued. "But at what cost? At whose pain?" A rustle went through the audience. Someone dropped a pen. A producer mouthed, "Keep rolling." Charles tried to recover. "Pain has touched every family in some form. Ours is no different." "But we were," Meghan said. "We weren't allowed to be different. Not visibly. Not culturally. Not emotionally. You gave us protocol when we needed protection. Procedure when we needed humanity." A stillness gripped Charles. And for the first time, he looked aged. Not as a king, but as a father who had let something vital slip through generations of marble expectations. "Would you have preferred I dismantled it all?" he asked softly. "No," Meghan replied. "I would have preferred you acknowledged it was already broken." Silence again. Not heavy, this time, hollow. The kind that followed a truth no one wanted spoken but everyone needed heard. Across social media, hashtags began to spike. Hashtag not protected. Hashtag the firm exposed. News anchors whispered off-screen, "This is history unfolding." And in the chamber, the King of England looked across at the woman who had once been family, now mirror, and saw something monarchy wasn't built to survive. A voice it couldn't control. Backstage, aides whispered furiously. Producers glanced at one another, unsure whether to cut the feed or let it burn. The public was watching, not just the debate, but the unraveling of a facade they thought was unshakable. Inside the chamber, Charles pressed his palms together. His knuckles whitened as he chose his next words. I understand now, that silence was not neutral. It spoke louder than words could. Meghan nodded, slowly. And in that silence, we were made disposable. For a moment, the audience sat in the same silence, now exposed for what it truly was. A tool. A cage. A shield that turned into a sword. Charles turned slightly, as if to share the burden with the room. I believed tradition would shelter us. But I see now it sheltered no one, it only hid the cracks. Meghan's voice softened. It's not just about me, Charles. It's about every outsider you asked to smile for the balcony but never let through the doors. It's about every daughter-in-law, every mixed-race child, every woman told to be silent for the good of the firm. Charles swallowed hard. The words "the firm" had never sounded so cold. A member of the audience stood up. It was a young woman, a student from Barbados flown in as a guest speaker. Her voice quivered. If the institution can't protect its own, what future can it promise the rest of us? The question landed like a stone in water. Charles looked toward her, the weight of empire pressing down. Then he turned to Meghan. Perhaps, he said carefully, the time for protection has passed. Perhaps now we must speak of repair. Meghan gave him a long, unreadable look. Repair starts with recognition. And you're only just beginning. The camera zoomed in once more, not to the throne, but to the reckoning seated before it. Outside, a crowd was gathering. Inside, the firm was cracking. The moderator tried to steer the discussion back, toward neutral ground, toward policy, legacy, anything safer than the storm now brewing between the crown and its most unrelenting critic. But the room no longer belonged to protocol. Meghan leaned forward, elbows on the table. You keep calling it the institution. But people run institutions. People build walls. And people choose when not to open doors. Charles shifted. You think I didn't want to help? I spoke behind closed doors. I pleaded with the press office. You whispered behind palace walls, Meghan interrupted, calm but sharp. While we were screaming in public. The audience froze. No one reached for water. No one coughed. No one moved. Across the hall, Charles inhaled through his nose. I was raised to endure, not to challenge. I was taught that survival meant silence. And I was taught, Meghan said, that silence is complicity. She wasn't shouting. But the line cracked the air. In that moment, Charles didn't look like a monarch. He looked like a man searching for footing on ground that no longer recognized him. Do you believe I failed you? He asked, almost inaudibly. Meghan's expression didn't soften. I believe you watched the failure happen. And I believe you let it. The moderator looked down, pretending to read notes. But there was nothing left to guide this. Charles stood slowly. Then say it plainly. If this is to be a public reckoning, let it be complete. Meghan met his eyes. You never protected us. The room held its breath. Charles looked at her, then at the room, and finally at himself. The image of monarchy, polished, poised, unshakable, was gone. All that remained was a man standing in the rubble of silence. And Meghan, no longer asking for space. But taking it. The clip hit social media before the session even ended. You never protected us. The phrase surged through timelines, stitched into TikTok montages, whispered in Twitter threads, turned into headlines. The Guardian called it a monarchy unmasked. The Daily Mail called it a betrayal in public view. But for many, it wasn't betrayal, it was truth, long denied and finally spoken aloud. At Buckingham Palace, aides scrambled to draft statements. The Royal Press Office issued a brief note: the King remains committed to open dialogue and the strength of family bonds. But the footage said otherwise. The King's silence, the tight line of his jaw, the way his hands trembled just slightly, none of it could be rewritten. In Barbados, crowds gathered in front of Parliament buildings, holding signs that read, "You never belonged," and "We remember silence." In Nigeria, a morning talk show debated if the Commonwealth was now a relic. In Toronto, a mural went up overnight, Meghan in front of the palace gates, with the caption, "Truth is the crown now." And back in the panel room, the moderator asked softly, "Would either of you care to make a closing remark?" Meghan looked to Charles. For the first time that evening, she extended the moment, not out of kindness, but finality. Charles exhaled. "I thought duty was sacrifice," he said. "But I see now, that duty without protection is abandonment." He turned, facing the crowd, the cameras, the world. "You were right," he said. "You never belonged, because we never made space. And that is a failing I will carry." Meghan didn't move. Didn't smile. But her silence this time was different. Not a plea. A verdict. The session closed. Reporters shouted questions as they exited. Charles walked slower than usual. Meghan walked straight. One represented what had always been. The other, what refused to be silent anymore. Outside the venue, the air had changed. Protesters lined the gates, not with rage, but with resolve. Signs read, "Truth doesn't need permission and history isn't always written by the crown." The winds of reform weren't just whispering anymore, they were marching. Back inside, Meghan stepped into a private lounge flanked by 2 aides. Her phone buzzed non-stop, calls from Oprah's team, messages from Caribbean politicians, even a request from the UN for a statement. She didn't answer any of them. Not yet. Meanwhile, Charles retreated to a secure room within the summit complex. Lord Crawley, his senior advisor, was already there. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "we can still frame this as unity through confrontation. A family willing to disagree in public. It's salvageable." Charles didn't respond. He was staring at the window, not watching the people, but the silence between them. "She said we never protected her," he murmured. Crawley nodded stiffly. "Yes, sir. She did." "And was she wrong?" Charles asked, turning slowly. The question landed heavier than the room was built to handle. Crawley hesitated. "What matters now is the narrative." "No," Charles cut in. "What matters is what I do next." That evening, as the summit prepared for its formal dinner, Charles made an unexpected request: cancel the red carpet, cancel the orchestra. Just chairs, a mic, and a live stream. The aides panicked. "Sir, a last-minute address? With no teleprompter?" "That's exactly what's needed," Charles replied. At 8:47 p.m., King Charles III stepped onto a bare stage. No crown. No regalia. Just a monarch in a dark suit beneath a single light. "I have stood for tradition all my life," he began. "But tradition that denies truth is not legacy. It's burden." The room was still. Even the critics paused. "And tonight," he said, "I choose to lay it down." Across the world, Meghan watched from a hotel room, arms crossed. She didn't nod. She didn't cry. But for the first time, she listened. The next morning, headlines didn't scream scandal. They whispered shift. "The King speaks without armor," The Independent. "From Heir to Human," The Times. "Monarchy meets reckoning," Al Jazeera. Across London, people gathered in parks and cafes, replaying Charles's speech. Not everyone agreed with him. Not everyone forgave. But something undeniable had happened. He had looked into the mirror, and for once, not turned away. At Windsor, Queen Camilla sat in silence as she read the transcript. "Do you think he meant it?" she asked one of her attendants. No one answered. Meanwhile, Meghan's phone lit up again. This time, it was her mother. "Did you hear him?" Doria asked. "I did," Meghan said. Her tone wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. "He said it without being forced." "He finally saw you." "No," Meghan replied after a pause. "He finally saw himself." Elsewhere, Caribbean leaders began issuing quiet statements. Jamaica's prime minister called for a re-evaluation of ties. Belize signaled a constitutional review. Barbados, now a republic, offered no comment, but its silence was louder than any declaration. Charles, alone in his study at Clarence House, wrote in his personal journal for the first time in weeks. The ink flowed slowly, the words plain. "She spoke. I listened. I did not fall. But I finally felt the weight." A knock came at the door. Lord Crawley entered, holding a folder. "Sir, we've been invited to a Commonwealth restructuring summit. They want to know your stance." Charles closed the journal gently. "My stance is, not what it was." On social media, a clip began to circulate. Not of Meghan, not of Charles, but of a schoolgirl in Accra who watched the debate and told her classroom, "If they can speak to power like that, maybe so can we." 3 weeks passed. The summit had ended. The journalists moved on. The flashbulbs faded. But the echo remained. At Buckingham Palace, the halls were quieter than usual. Charles moved slower, not from age, but from the gravity of what had shifted. In one of the lesser rooms, he stood before a painting, Queen Victoria, gazing out across a canvas of conquered lands. He looked at her, and for once, didn't feel proud. Down in Montecito, Meghan walked through her garden with Archie and Lilibet. She paused to check her phone. A BBC headline read, "King Charles supports voluntary reparations discussion." She exhaled. Not victory. Not closure. But movement. In Jamaica, a referendum date was announced, November. In Ghana, a new education program launched called Legacy and Liberation. In London, the Royal Collection Trust quietly removed several colonial artifacts from display, without ceremony. Back at Clarence House, Charles met privately with his son William. The room was thick with unspoken lines. William finally asked, "Do you regret it?" Charles didn't look up. "I regret waiting this long." "And her?" "She told me I never protected her," Charles said. "But I never protected any of them." Outside the palace, a protester held up a cardboard sign. It didn't say, "Down with the crown." It didn't call for blood. It said, "Belonging isn't inherited. It's earned." That night, Charles sat alone at his desk. He removed his ring, the royal seal heavy with centuries, and placed it gently into a drawer. Not a resignation. Not an abdication. Just a gesture. In Montecito, Meghan lit a candle on her windowsill. For herself. For her children. For anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Sometimes history turns with a sword. This time, it turned with a sentence.